Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. I always want to thank folks who actually come or come online. Uh, I know our world is not the most interesting and exciting world on television or in person at night, but I really appreciate all the folks who come out and are willing to ask questions and show interest in the community, because I've had a lot of dialogue with folks during this process the last month or two, and I know one of the big concerns people have is this is a lot of responsibility we're taking on, and do we have a community that understands this level of responsibility that they're taking on? And so I think that's part of our role too, is to help people understand this is definitely a big commitment to whether or not to make a decision to become a city. Our roles don't change all that much. We'll talk more about that in a second, but certainly it's that next step in the process. I kind of see it like, you've got that kid, he's out of school, but he's working, he's fairly independent, but he's still living at home. And then you have to decide, when is that point where this person is ready to go out and live on their own, even though you're already doing a lot of it. So that's what I kind of see with Cityhood as well. Are we ready to get out of our parents' basement and have our own place to live? So that's kind of the problem. I've been trying to figure out what's a good analogy here. That was about the best I could do. So why don't, just like the other meetings, what we found is, remember, we want the folks on Zoom to be able to hear questions as well. We're going to do a presentation, and then we're going to take questions, but the cleanest way to take questions is we've got sheets of paper in the back of the room and pens or pencils. I can't tell which we had, and I think it's pens. And just go ahead and set the questions up here on the table. And then at the end of the process, we'll answer questions. We'll also be transcribing the questions in the chat as well. And then once we're done with the formal Q&A process, then we'll stick around as long as you want, if you want to discuss things in any more detail. But we want to make sure that there's the same opportunity for the people online as are in the room to be able to get their questions answered. And hopefully most of the questions will get answered during the presentation, but I know there'll need to be clarifications, and we've tried to add to the presentation over the last couple months so that we can anticipate as many questions as possible. And then we add in we've tried to add things in. And whatever you don't get to, this evening, don't forget that we do have our webpage that we're regularly updating as well. But as you know, ballots went out this week. Everybody get theirs in the mail? I know I did. And so we're at that point in time where the election started, and our ballot box is it unlocked now officially, Nicole? Is our ballot box, which is out back, is now open. And so we are now in our 28-day window of the election. And as most of you know, if you have all the way up until election day to vote in person or put it in the mail, although I wouldn't mail it the last day, because I think they only accept it up to 7 days after March 5th. So if you want your vote counted, it's always best to vote early, particularly if you're voting by mail. And then remember, because there's the opportunity to vote either by mail or in person, once the registrar gets all the ballots, he has to make sure that someone didn't vote both in person and by mail. It's interesting, in a lot of states, what they do is they have an early period that then closes so that there is a gap so that they don't have to reconcile. So, like it used to be in Nevada, you had to do the early voting up to like 5 days before election day. And that way they knew on election day whether or not you had voted or not. And that way, if you came and you'd already voted beforehand, they said, no, you can't vote twice again. But in California, they have to reconcile and make sure that the mail-in ballots and early ballots don't have any contradiction with any ballots that were done actually on election day. I think in the last couple elections, virtually everybody, I think maybe 90% voted before election day. But in any case, and then the county has about a 30-day period to make sure that they've reconciled all the ballots, and usually about once a week or so. The first night, I think mostly what they count is just the early ballots that have come in, and then you get additional reports over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And then usually by the 1st of April is when they certify the election. Yeah, I think you should bring your ballot with you. Yeah, you bring your ballot with you if you're coming to the voting place as well. That makes it a lot. If you don't, then it gets very complicated. Right, so everybody's gotten a ballot in the mail. So it's best just to use that one. It makes it easier on election day. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started then with the presentation. Yeah, it's very different than the olden days where everybody just showed up on a Tuesday and voted, but we get more participation this way also. So yeah, today's Tuesday, right? So it's 4 weeks from today. And then 4 more weeks to finalize the results. So the marathon begins. So let's go ahead on to the next slide. So Mountain House, we have lots of different debates as to when Mountain House was established. The land acquisition started in the late 80s. Most of the early planning work was through about 1993, and then the actual master plan itself, a lot of the analysis was done in 92, 93. The master plan was established in 1994. Mountain House was always envisioned as a self-contained community, providing all of its services and having a mix of housing and employment. And part of the master plan vision and the way that Mountain House was set up financially was to be independent enough to be able to become a city at some point in the future. So about 1996, the actual financing district or governing district was set up. And until 2008, when we had our first election, right, in November of 2008, but between 1996 and 2008, as they were doing all the preparation and the early building, the County Board of Supervisors also sat as the governing board for the Mountain House Community Services District, which is why we have agreements that are very favorable to the county in many cases, because the county was the Board of Supervisors. All they had to do is change their hat, and then they'll say, okay, we're going to have Mountain House pay for that. And then that's what they would vote as the county to say, okay, Mountain House is going to have to pay for this. And they'd sit down and then as the Mountain House board and say, yes, we approve that we're paying this to the county. So it wasn't until the requirement was we had to have 1,000 registered voters before Mountain House could have its own independent governing board. And I have the data somewhere, but I think we were at about 3,000, maybe 2,000. I have to look. I have it somewhere. I think we had a couple thousand registered voters by the time we had that first election. And as most folks know, we've had 2 Mountain Houses. We had the 2003 to 2010 Mountain House, where we got about 10,000 people moving in a very short period of time. Then we had that time we don't talk about called the recession, where nobody moved in and a lot of people moved out. And then since about 2014-15, until we ran out of land temporarily, we had our next huge increase. And as you know, I think we've got 3 lots over there in Langston left where the parking was for the model homes. And once that's done, Hanson's basically complete, except for the parcel at the corner that is an apartment site for some point in the future. And then Cordis, they've now pulled the last of the building permits in Cordis and Langston 2. They're not all under construction yet, but they pulled all of their building permits for Langston 2. And then, as you may know, the commercial site in Cordis has now been converted to a site for the school district to build recreation and/or school facilities on. So that's really the remaining parcel in Cordis, along with where the Welcome Center is. That's the only thing left in Cordis. And then we've got 631 of the 2,000 lots that have been completed in College Park, and we should have a lot of dirt. We just had some additional land annexed, and you should see dirt moving very soon just to the east of Costa School. And as you know, while all this work's been going on, we did get this beautiful building and this amazing, well-attended library built back in 2020, which I think was a real milestone for the community. It's easy to remember the day we opened because it was the day we had to close everything, March 17th, 2020. As most of you know, looking north, the bridge to nowhere is going to be a bridge to somewhere very soon. And we've got the first 503 lots that are breaking ground right now, with 453 lots just behind that up north of Byron. And we're going to be breaking ground next week on our second fire station, because having a fire station is a requirement. Because we're such a rectangular city, if we were more square, we might be able to get away with one fire station. But because of the fact that we're more long than wide, I did all the analysis, looked 3 or 4 times, looked to see, gee, maybe if we move the fire station to the bridge, but no, to make sure we have good coverage, and it's something they figured out many years ago, we've got to have a second fire station north of Byron. So that's going to be breaking ground next week. We're also in the final stages of getting ready on the next phase of Central Park, which will be the amphitheater, dog park, and additional tennis courts. And hopefully about 2 years out would be the next phases of Central Park. We'll have another meeting about that in the future, or we can talk about it afterwards, but we're making a lot of progress on Central Park. We've finished the second of 3 expansions of the water treatment plant, and we are just about done with the wastewater treatment plant expansion. In fact, we just moved the engines, right? We've now actually transferred from the old plant to, it's all in the same place, but your sewage is now going through the new plant instead of the old plant, pretty much, right? That's correct. So I know we didn't have a big ceremony about that, but I think we'll all agree that our toilets flushing is probably one of the most important, probably the most important thing that we do as a community. And so your toilets are still flushing. So Jody's staff got that done. So a lot has been happening, a lot of the stuff that people don't always hear about. So this kind of just gives you a good view of 1994 to the present. Cityhood was pointed out back in 94. It was discussed beginning again in 2015. The board started taking formal actions based on the recommendations of the committee that was set up back in 2020. We had a lot of paperwork and studies we had to do with the county and what's called the Local Area Formation Committee. And so March 5th is the election. If the election is successful, July 1 is the effective date. So to make sure you don't lose track of this on the ballot, it's Measure D, and there's a lot on there on Measure D, but it's essentially, do you want to be a city or not? Cityhood. And so it's basically to establish us as an independent self-governing city, based on all the research and analysis that's been done the last couple of years. And like I said, community meetings going all the way back to 2015. Next slide. And why do this? Well, I think self-control is what, local control is something that I think most folks want for their community. You have control over you would have control over virtually all services. You have most of that control now, but not complete control. And we get more opportunities for federal and state grants. There's a lot more money that we can get under Cityhood than we can as a special district. And all future, I know there's still a lot of confusion on this, but right now, while the master plan dictates, the implementation of the master plan is governed by the County Board of Supervisors. By state law, only counties and cities have land use authority, meaning deciding the zones, what can be built, where things can be built. Only cities and counties can do that, which is why we don't have that power now. But once you're a city, then you are given that responsibility to determine the future growth of the community. Next slide. And so I think on top of that, it gives us the opportunity as a city to sit on we're lucky enough to be on the Valley Link board at this point in time, and some other things like some things related to Highway 239, but we don't get to be on the Council of Governments board, which is the ones who decide where all of our state, federal, and county road dollars go. So that's one with a heck of a lot, millions of dollars behind it each year. We do not currently have a seat at the table. The county is our seat at the table. And if you notice, the last time they improved Byron Road, that seat at the table took that money and the paving stopped the minute they got to the CSD boundary. So in the future, we get to speak up for our own share of that money. Right now, the county speaks for us. And remember, I told you earlier how the county set up all these agreements between itself when it was the board. One of the things the county did 20 plus years ago was to say, when it comes to all roads in Mountain House, even the roads that used to be county roads, such as Wickland and Bethany and Byron, we're gonna give you a little bit of the existing property tax, and then we're gonna put all the burden of maintenance of those existing roads on you, CSD. And by the way, we're gonna give you this little bit of property tax, but not share with you any of the countywide or state or federal sales tax. So those are things we don't have dollars for now. We would get once we became a city. So that's the most important of the boards that we're sitting on. This is the other one we get a lot of questions on. They're like, well, there has to be a tax increase, right? Because now we're taking on these responsibilities. And we'll talk about this in more detail in a second. All it is doing is it's rearranging where money goes. It's not changing anything that you pay right now as far as taxes. It's just giving us a different allocation of the dollars than we received in the past. So let's go on to the next slide. So what happens is that, we'll show more in a second, we get a greater share of property tax. So next slide. And then on sales tax, we don't get any sales tax right now. Now, Mountain House doesn't have a lot of businesses, so we don't generate a lot of sales tax, but any sales tax being generated now, well, most sales tax goes to the state anyway, but the percentage that normally would go to the local government goes to the county. Special districts don't get sales tax. Just like land use, only cities and counties, for the most part, get the general sales tax. So of the 7 7/8 sales tax right now, 1% of that 7 is what's called the local share, and that 1% now goes to the county for whatever they want to spend it on anywhere else in the county. Once we're a city, that money comes to us. The next slide. So this shows you a little more detail where the money goes. That you see the state gets the first 6%, the county or city gets the next 1%. There's a 1/4 cent that goes to transportation at the state level that then gets allocated back to the county. And so the statewide tax, so if you're in a county that has no locally adopted countywide tax, like if you go to Amador County or somewhere like that, probably the sales tax rate is 7.25. In San Joaquin County, every 20 years or so, the voters of San Joaquin County have approved an additional 1/2 cent sales tax. So that in San Joaquin County, no matter where you are, you're paying the 7.25 statewide rate, and then you're paying a 1/2 cent towards money that the Council of Governments gets that goes to all these different road projects. So next slide. So this gives you an idea of nearby sales tax rates. So you can see when you go over to Tracy, Tracy has a 1/2 cent local tax that goes to I think it's going to things like parks and roads and things like that. So when you buy in Tracy versus Mountain House, you're, in most cases, and we'll talk about the exceptions, you're paying a 0.5% more here. And Manteca has an additional 1/2 cent for public safety. And Lathrop has an additional 1 cent that goes towards, I think, fire and police. Livermore actually does not have any additional taxes, but Alameda County has 3% on top of the statewide for a whole bunch of different countywide services. So anytime you're over in the East Bay at Costco or wherever it may be, you're paying 2.5% more at minimum. I think most of the East Bay cities are at 10 1/4. You get over to Berkeley and Oakland, I think you may be paying even a little bit more because they have a local tax on top of that big county tax that they have in Alameda County. Brentwood, you can see, has a local tax. Lodi, Stockton has a public safety tax. They actually have a tax for the libraries in Stockton as well. And you can see Escalon and Ripon, they don't have any local tax, just like we wouldn't have any local tax. So generally, when you're going into Safeway, and for the things that are, remember, food's not a good example because not all foods are taxable. But if you're just buying an item in the store, walking out with it and taking it home, you're going to pay whatever the rate is in that community. So if you're over in Livermore, you're paying an extra 10 1/4. If you're paying in Tracy, you're paying 8 1/4, et cetera. However, there are exceptions to that. If you're buying a appliance or something that's getting delivered to your home from a retail store, I don't even want to talk about your warehouse purchases because we'd be here all night because it's a moving target. But if say you're going to Home Depot and you purchased a new dishwasher and it's getting delivered to your home, you will not pay the Tracy extra ½ cent for that. Now, conversely, if somebody in Tracy were to buy something here getting delivered to Tracy, guess what? They have to pay that ½ cent. When I was city manager in City of Davis, we made more money off of purchases in Woodland than we made money off purchases in Davis because we didn't have a Home Depot or we didn't have any of the large box stores. So that extra sales tax in Davis, just all the deliveries alone generated more than all the sales in Davis. And we had car dealerships and it still didn't make a difference. So in any case, so if you purchase something somewhere else, you're paying less than you would be. The other thing, and the one thing where it's not a delivery, there's also a special rule for automobiles. And when you fill out your bill of sale, they will tie it right back to your address statewide, and you're going to be paying a sales tax rate based on where you live. So if you do buy a car in Dublin where the sales tax is 10 1/4, you're not paying 10 1/4 for that car in Dublin, you're paying 7.75. So when you're buying your Tesla for $80,000, that's 2.5%. That's what, $2,000, right? So it's a real savings living here in Mountain House. So on property tax, I won't go into all the history of a property tax, but before 1978, the city, the county, the water district, everybody generated their own tax bill and came up with their own tax rate. Didn't have to go to the voters. The school district said, we need this much money this year. This is how much the rate's going to be, and we're going to send out a bill for that rate. And of course, so there was no coordination. So if you had a county where everybody wanted a lot of money in the schools and nobody was paying attention to what the city was spending, you could have a 4%, in theory, property tax rate. And the other thing back then was each year your house got reassessed. And in most parts of California from 1970 to 1980, your house went up 600%. Most average house in California went from like 17,000 to 102,000 from 1970 to 80. So each year, not only were you getting these new tax rates from these taxing entities, but each year the assessor was reassessing, and a lot of states still do this. Each year you got assessed to the new rate. So imagine you're a senior citizen on a fixed income and your house assessment goes from 50 to 80,000 in 1 year like it did back then, which is why Prop 13 came along, and that capped everybody at a total of 1%. So what they did back then is they took what everybody was getting and then they said, okay, right now the total rate in San Joaquin County is 2.5%. So we're just reducing everybody's property tax by 60%. And from now on, if you're 15% of all the taxes generated in the county, that's what you're always going to get in the future. And remember, in every little part of the county as well, there's different districts that were taxing districts. So if you want to figure out your tax rate, there's a 1,000-page document that tells you every single separate, even in Mountain House, there's a different tax rate for the irrigation district up north, a different one down south, and then there's others, like a mosquito abatement district that may be on these properties and not that. But in any case, our share of that 1% depending on where you are in town, varies. Most of the central part of town, neighborhoods E, F, G, H, or Wickland, Bethany, Altamont, Cuesta, most of those properties, the tax rate's about 15.73. North of Byron, as those houses get sold, those are at about 17.6, and south of Grant Line, it's kind of in between as far as what the tax rate is now. Now, when we went through this incorporation study, part of what happens is that right now, as an unincorporated area, the county still covers all of the costs for animal control and half of the cost essentially for sheriff. We have to pay for the actual officers on patrol, but we don't have to pay for the lieutenants, the captains, the people doing the paperwork back at the jail, none of those things. But once we're a city, we're now 100% responsible, whether we have our own police department, whether we contract with the county, whether we contract with another city, we are now responsible for 100% of our law enforcement cost. And so that's an extra about $2.5 million a year. And so part of all the complicated formulas, we now get an extra chunk of property tax to make up for the fact that the county no longer has to subsidize the law enforcement costs of Mountain House. They now get fully reimbursed for Mountain House policing costs if this is approved. And that means our tax share is going to go up 3.79%. So we're going to go from 15.7 to 19.5 and up. So we're going to be up around 20% of the property tax share, which countywide is a pretty good deal. It's actually more than Lathrop and Manteca receive in property tax share. And I can show that to you, but I'd have to give you a whole 1,000-page document to figure it out. But that's essentially the average. Now, remember, your property taxes can go up 2% a year, and they do get readjusted upon resale. And remember, the special taxes, which are separate from property tax, those get considered for adjustment each year as well. But that's irrespective of whether you're a city or a special district. And all the special taxes get transferred over from the community services district to the city. Because the only reason we got to exist as a special district was because of the special taxes. Without the special taxes, we would not exist. That's about 2/3 of our general fund revenue. So this gives you an idea of all the other folks who share in that 1%. So you can see there's the county, the road district is now ours. You can see the library gets a little bit of the property tax. That's why we pay a very nominal amount for the operation of the library. Most of the library is paid for through this property tax. I mean, what do we pay, Sarah, for the library? It's very nominal. About $50,000 a year out of all the costs that are over there are all we have to pay for the library. And that's mostly just facility maintenance. And we do pay for some extra hours for them to be open as well. You can see the school district gets 19%. And then if you look at the bottom, they also get what's called ERAF. And that's a long story I've talked about too many times, but essentially back in the early 90s, the state decided that they didn't want to have to subsidize schools too much. So they stole about 1/4 of the county's property tax away, basically took half of the county's share of the property tax and gave it to the schools. And that's giving you like the 1-sentence summary of something that would take me 3 days to explain. But the bottom line is, the main reason that we have to have these special taxes is that when we became in the old days, the county would have given us a bigger chunk of the property taxes when we took over these services. But because the county lost a good chunk of their taxes to the state, the county said, knock yourself out, go become a district, but you're on your own and you have to figure out your own way to generate revenue. And so the pie shrunk. And so the only way we could do this was by increasing the pie, or else we wouldn't be a CSD or there would be no houses here. Next slide. So again, it's just a shifting of the taxes over time. Next slide. So I thought we'd get a lot of questions about this. And I won't get into tax bill 101 too much, but if we talk about taxes, you're going to go back and you're going to look at your tax bill and you're going to see that 1% You're going to see a little bit of bonded indebtedness on the high school bond and the Delta College bond, and then you're going to see our special taxes. What you're not going to see on your tax bill that is on the tax bill in Tracy Hills and River Islands is a whole bunch of other charges, including charges for the capital cost of your utility system. Because the decision was made well before any of us were around, was that instead of putting that charge on the tax bill, that charge was going to be a supplement to your utility bill. So we just thought it'd be important to see this comparison. And so if you look at, you can see our operations and maintenance rate on a typical house for water, sewer, and storm is about $85. You can see in Lathrop, that same charge is about $149, and in Tracy, it's about $102. So I think we're doing pretty well there. I think partly we have a new plant. We think we're operating at a very efficient capacity. Yeah, we got to put that up to the top if you can, so we can see the numbers at the bottom. There we go. But you can see that on top of that, though, we have those pledged facility charges. You can see that add up to about $103 a year. I'm sorry, a month. And that, again, is on an average home. What you don't see is that if you are in Tracy Hills and you're in Lathrop, along with a whole bunch of other charges you don't have here for other things that are kind of like the special tax, they also have basically on what would work out to on a monthly basis about $97 a month in Lathrop and about $140 in River Islands, and in Tracy Hills you can see it's about $147 a month. So, but what you see it on the tax bill as $1,000 here and $1,700 there. So I think since we had you in here and we were already geeking out about finances, we thought we would throw in this comparison of our rates to our other neighbors down here in South County. So you can see, we think we compete pretty well. And then on top of that, I think one of the underrated things that I pick on Trimark from time to time on some of these things like that previous bill that we get the phone calls on, he doesn't, is that back in 1996, when he was looking at this, PG&E was very busy doing deregulation, which of course created all the power outages of the late 90s. It's ironic that well, I won't get it, but it was a good time for PG&E to want to be, friendly to people. And so the founders of Mountain House decided, maybe we would like to start from scratch here and do what a lot of the other folks do in the valley, and that's have an irrigation district run our utilities instead of PG&E, because PG&E has all these huge stranded costs that we really don't want to have to pay for here in Mountain House. And on top of that, MID was willing to cut a deal with the builders, which saved you money when you bought your house, where normally the home builder has to pay for the connection from the street to the house. Probably was $3,000 or $4,000 back then, probably $10,000 now. MID, because they wanted the business, they pay that cost. Now, what MID wasn't banking on back then was all the people going to solar and the requirements for solar. But particularly in the older neighborhoods where not everybody's on solar, I think you really see the difference, because you can see that if you're a typical house with little or no solar, you're going to be using 1,000 kilowatt hours in the summer and about 800 in the winter. And you can see that MID's rates are far less than either Lathrop Irrigation or PG&E. I can tell you personally, I have a son in college who's in an all-electric apartment who is paying more in PG&E for 500 square feet than I'm paying for like 5 times that amount. So I can tell you that one of the things, while I know there's a lot of angst over the water bill and everything else, but there's a considerable cost savings in this community being MID. I'm sure some of you came from the Bay Area and had PG&E and felt the pain, and you probably came from an older house. And I can tell you, I went from a 1973 house to a 2003 house, and I think my electric bill consumption dropped by more than half. So we've got very energy efficient homes here and much lower rates than you'd be experiencing if you were anywhere else. So if you were in Tracy right now on PG&E or the offshoot of PG&E, you can see that in the summertime, you're paying about double in Tracy what you're paying in Mountain House. So next time you have that angst with your utility, your water bill, you should look at your MID bill and say, it's not that bad. So governance structure. So right now, we've mentioned a couple of times, we're governed by a CSD board of directors. We have one here this evening, right? I don't see anybody else there. And if we were a city, instead of a board of directors, we would have a city council and mayor. And instead of there being a general manager who operates the CSD on a daily basis, it would be a city manager responsible for that, which is the typical form of government here in California. You have maybe one or two cities in the large cities where you have an executive mayor, but in most cities in the Western United States and a lot of the rest of the country now too, it's a part-time, essentially city council with a professional staff operating things on a daily basis. The CSD would not go away. It would become a subsidiary district of the city, and it would stick around because cities are not allowed to do master restrictions. In fact, we're, I think, one of 18 CSDs that got special legislation to be able to do master restrictions. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, and the other thing that happens is then there's more of a seat at regional boards and participation in things like the League of Cities, where you have 482 other cities that you work with to represent us up in Sacramento, where they like to make lots of rules that aren't always to our advantage from time to time. So this goes over all the 18 services that we perform now. And if we were to become a city, we would also get land use, building and safety, code enforcement, not just master restriction enforcement, but they call it code enforcement. It's really more zoning enforcement versus just master restriction. It gives us more ability to do traffic control. Right now, in counties of less than 1 million, unincorporated areas can only be the traffic control, CHP has to be the lead. But if you're a city, then you're not wholly dependent on CHP. And then we mentioned animal control, and then we also have the option for economic development, business attraction, those types of things. Right now, we're financed primarily, as I mentioned, through the property tax and the 4 special taxes, and we do not have the ability to gain other revenues. With Cityhood, there's a number of revenues, as we mentioned, such as sales tax, that now go to the state that we would then have access to. We also would get as we said, a larger share of the property tax, and we would get what's called the documentary transfer tax, which is a tax when you sell your house, you have to pay 1.1% in this tax. Right now, we get none of that. We would get half of that tax if we became a city. And again, that's another one where it's a bargain here. If you were over in the Bay Area and sold a house, a lot of those are charter cities. And I think in places like San Francisco, it's as much as 10 times as high, that transaction tax. And down in Los Angeles, by the way, they have an even higher tax on houses of 5 million or more. So there was a real run on selling those. And that's kind of a starter home in LA now, right? I think 5 million seems like. But so what else is on the ballot? Well, the other thing on the ballot is Measure E. And we'll talk about that for a second. And this is required by the state to determine how you're going to do your future elections. And of course, there's 3 different ways. There's at large, by district, or from district. And I think we have another slide that talks about that a little bit more. I better go back. I think I moved that one around. But let's go back. So at large means everybody in the city can vote for everybody running for office. And there's no requirement as to where you live. As long as you live in the city, you can run for office. As long as you live here, you can vote. By district is where you have to live in a district to run for that office, and you have to live in that district to vote for those people. So only the people in that district select. And then you have what's called from district, which means you have to live within one of the districts to run for office, but you're selected by the entire city. The next slide. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second. And so the voters elect a mayor and 4 council members. 2 of the council members will have a short term the first time, so that we have at least 2 seats up in every election. So you don't want to have it where every 4 years you could have a complete turnover of the city council. So at the next election in November of 20, and we won't be doing a March election next time, we'd go back to a typical November election. So the first term will be a little bit longer. But the two council members, winning council members, the lowest number of votes will have to run again in 26, and then it'll be a 4-year term. I think and then in 2028, the folks who had the most votes would be up for office, and the mayor would be up for office, again, up for office as well. So, okay, so the mayor is always selected at large. And then I just described again, that's right, we just added this one today. So we're going to give you a chart in a second of what cities do by district and which do at large and which do from district, because what's happened is there's state law that has really encouraged a lot of cities to begin to do district elections, because the legislature felt like there was more representation by district. There's frankly a lot of debate on that when you get into smaller cities. So there's a lot more debate, the smaller the city, over whether or not it makes sense to really break a city down into districts or not. So next slide. And I haven't gotten the email back yet, but this slide shows you how many cities are in each population range, and then how many are at large, how many are from district, how many are by district. And what I haven't gotten back from the folks who gave me this information yet is I do want to know which city under 1,000 residents actually has districts. I can't wait to find out who that is. So you can see 6 cities between 5 and 10,000 actually have district elections as well. You can see that in the 30 to 50,000 range, we're at about half at large, half by district. And you can see the larger the city, the more common it is for them to be by district. So I know we've had a lot of questions on that. And one of the reasons you don't see a lot of from district voting is that the legislature has really pushed people to by district. And there's other reasons too from the olden days, but so you can see at large and by district are the typical ways that folks do it in the state. Oh, he did send it, oh, Bradbury? Yeah, that's this private little almost gated community right up against the mountains there. That makes sense that it's Bradbury. Not surprised. They used to have over 1,000, so they probably dropped, and as all the kids left, nobody left. So how would the city, if you choose by district, the city would be divided into 4 pretty much equally populated districts. There's a whole public process that we'd be required to go through. And there's a whole number of different state and federal laws that go into that, but we don't have to get into all that tonight, because if you're really interested in that, I would recommend you go to the Lambertville Unified School District site, click on district voting, or it might be under CVRA. And there's an awesome about 20-minute PowerPoint presentation on YouTube where you can learn everything you ever wanted to know about how districts are done. And I think if you're someone who's interested in data, you should click on their sample maps, because these sample maps give you not only the population in each district, not only the voter turnout in each district, it gives you the total population, it gives you the citizen population, it gives you the voter turnout of the last 2 elections. It tells you how many people speak English at home in each district. There's just more information than you could ever imagine, and they've got 5 different maps that you can take a look at. So, ready for any questions? Do we have any? Have one? All right. Does anyone pay $189 in Mountain House for their utility bill? I think it depends on the time of year, right? I knew I shouldn't have brought up the utilities. I think that was the average over the year. That's more. All right. Are there plans on having shopping and dining in the near future? And, as I mentioned, economic development is one of the things we can do as a community. But I can tell you that retail takes time. It used to be that you had a grocery store for every 10,000 residents. Nowadays, particularly in a culturally diverse community, you have one grocery store for every 50,000 residents because, for example, when the Safeway store opened, we have data showing most of the Safeway customers were drawn from the Safeway in Tracy. But we also looked to see whether the Hispanic market on Tracy Boulevard or the Indian market on Tracy Boulevard, whether we impacted those markets. 0% change. All the people shopping in Tracy at the ethnic markets are still shopping in those markets. And so we're from a Safeway standpoint, we're more like a town of 15,000 people, not a town of 30,000. And on top of that, and it isn't just the specialty markets, the other thing that's happened to grocery stores, even in markets where there isn't a lot of diversity, they're going for every 20, 25,000 people now, because if you hadn't noticed, Costco, Walmart, and Target have taken about 30 to 40% of the sales that used to go to your traditional grocery stores. And because we're already in the 10-minute radius of what are now, and Winco, of all the big box grocery stores, that's had a real impact on our store. Our store does fewer customers than the Discovery Bay store. And there's only about 15,000 people up in Discovery Bay, but the difference is it's a lot longer for those people to drive to Brentwood than it is for us to Tracy. And so retail nowadays is a real challenge. Drugstores, we've been trying to talk to the CVS and Walgreens. They're not expanding anywhere right now because so many of the prescription medications are being mailed to folks now. And so there just isn't, with all the changes in retail, if you look at the amount of retail sales generated in this community, we should have the equivalent of 4 or 5 times the size of Safeway, but with Tracy nearby, with the diverse population, and with delivery and all those things, we probably have, we really have the equivalent of 2 Walmarts of sales going just into delivery and things like that, much less the fact that we're close to these other markets. And so, it's going to be a real challenge. Even, frankly, trying to get some of the food and other smaller retailers to go in right behind Safeway. A couple of years ago, they were looking, but now with the changes in the marketplace, with the fact that Safeway is not to that level yet, I would predict it's going to take another 10 to 20,000 residents before we see a lot more retail filling out. We will probably see a specialty market or two down at Grantline Road, at that location where you see the sign. But I think we've got a tougher road to hoe up here right next door to Safeway at this point in time. It's a very different world for retail than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So how much sales tax comes to the city? Well, I can't remember exactly what we put in the budget, but it's nominal at this point in time because Safeway, a typical Safeway will not generate a huge amount of taxable sales. The Safeway gas station will likely generate equivalent. I would guess that Safeway, and we're not allowed to disclose what but I can tell you a typical grocery store of that size would generate about $50,000 a year in sales tax, and a gas station like that would generate about $50,000 a year in sales tax. If we're looking at sales tax producers, the best thing are often a warehouse that's a point of sale or something like that. But, if we become a city, we can talk a lot more about strategies on those types of things. Another thing that's very good at generating revenue for the community are hotels. But again, the hotel market's pretty saturated around here. And, they can, depending on, I think initially what we'd be doing is we'd be taking on the county TOT rates called the transfer tax, which is like 8 or 9%. And you always have the ability to raise that, but like any other tax increase, it goes to the voters. Frankly, a bed tax is probably the easiest thing to get the voters to raise because that's all paid by people from the outside. When Rex and I were in Manteca, we got a lot of heat that we weren't bringing in enough, and so that's how the Great Wolf Lodge deal got financed, is because Great Wolf, you've got average room night of $400 or $500 a night, and so those are where you really can get a lot of money off of bed tax. But those are good revenue producers for the community. So the additional revenue, will not be 1.75%. The additional revenue will be the state collects 7.25% a quarter of, they give us 1 cent of that 7.25, and the county gets a quarter of that for transportation. And in San Joaquin County, we have an additional 0.5 cent that then we compete for. There is some of it we'll get as a city on a per capita basis. So there is some of that 0.5 cent countywide that gets shared back to Mountain House. But yeah, we would get 1 cent on a purchase. So on a $50,000 car, we don't have any car dealerships, but if we did, that would be $500, for example. But the rest of that goes to other entities. Zoning. So there's, again, that could be a good seminar in itself, and I think we took that map down that had zoning in there. But the master plan outlines your general land uses, which are residential, commercial, industrial, and then public / parks open space. Those are what you call your land use designations. And then within each one of those different types of designations, there's different levels allowed of residential and commercial and industrial. And so the zoning tells you in this neighborhood, it's zoned RM, which means you can build up to 7 units per acre. If it's RL, you can build up to 4. If it's RMH, you can build up to 12. If it's RH, you can build up to 20. So the city is a series of all these different zones, and the same in commercial. There's some places where it's restricted to retail. There's other places where it's restricted to warehouses or job generating businesses. And industrial, there's light industrial, meaning there's not a lot of outdoor noise. It's all contained inside the building. And then there's heavy industrial. That's the land owned up by the sewer plant where there's 100 acres where you can do more uses, more intensive type of industrial uses. So that's zoning. When you become a city, you're required to review that master plan when you first, your current plan, and you have to do what's called a general plan where you review all the zoning in the community, all the land uses and zones. It's about a 3 to 5 year process. And again, that would take days to explain, but the important thing to note is that the city is required within 36 months to adopt a updated plan. And it's a hugely involved public participation process, because again, land use is probably the ultimate local control, but not like it used to be, because nobody seems to want to have any neighbors after they move in. The state has put in a lot of requirements now to make sure that you're not the last person in the door. It's the reason that houses in Mountain House are $1 million now, is because of the fact that the state has had these rules, frankly, for about 50 years, but they've really never enforced those rules until recently. I couldn't believe when I went to the League of Cities conference last year and went into the session with the folks from the state to do the enforcement, and they had a whole different look than they'd ever had before. They finally are taking heed of the fact that if everybody builds a moat, none of our kids are going to have a place to live. But I already said more than I should on that. So luckily my phone's not buzzing, which means my wife decided not to yell at me during that comment. So, all right, can the amphitheater be converted to an indoor facility by the city council? Well, we already have an indoor facility being planned right across the street. And it's going to take some time to plan that, because the cost and construction of an indoor facility is conservatively about 7 to 10 times the cost of an outdoor facility. And so, it's one of the things we'll be working with the Parks and Rec Commission to talk about the finances for what we want to build in the future. One of the challenges we have is that while we had a very exhaustively planned master plan back at the turn of the century, there was never a real fiscal analysis that the county did associated with that. And so back in 2020, through the wisdom of our board of directors, we decided it was time to do a much more in-depth look at our Parks and Recreation master plan. And so we had about an 18-month process. We had well over 1,000 people fill out surveys. We had a number of interactive sessions with the community where we realized that we needed to right-size our facilities, because not only was there never a actual cash flow model done for our parks and open space, but we have this other challenge that if you look at costs from the time we were working on this around 2000, since 2000, Inflation, total inflation is about 80%. And so wages have gone up about the same, 80%. Construction materials and construction labor have gone about double that, about 140%. But wait, there's more, because there's not just construction materials and labor, there's all the new lighting, there's all of the it takes about 10 times as many sprinkler heads to not use water. You know, it used to be you put in one sprinkler head and you watered 300 square feet. Now, literally, there might be $10,000 of sprinklers where you used to have that $5 sprinkler head. I'm not exaggerating. So again, 80% inflation, 140% increase in construction, materials, and labor, and the actual cost of building based on modern regulations have gone up 300%. So a park that was budgeted at $7.5 million in 2000 is now almost $30 million. And so the board wisely said, we have to live within our means. We have to make sure that because we want to have a community that's sustainable. And I can tell you, as one who had to work in a couple of different communities as city manager during the recession, you have those projects that seem like a really good idea about 1975, and now it's 2009, and you've got to replace them, and it costs 3 times as much, and they're not up to code, and they have a roof that needs to be fixed, and the group that wanted this in the first place. In fact, teen centers are the hardest one. You have a group in 1 year that planned the teen center, and no teen ever wants to go in that building again, and you just spent $3 million on the building. But those are the challenges that we have when I think we have to be, and the board we have to be very careful when we're doing bricks and mortar, because there's nothing, once you have that bricks and mortar, you not only have that capital cost, you have that long-term maintenance cost as well. And so when we updated the parks plan, we took a look to say, okay, we need to be practical about this. We can't have, it's one thing to have 30,000 square feet of indoor uses in one building, but to have 10,000 of it in the south and 5,000 of it in the north and 20,000 in the town center, you've now tripled your operating costs, and now you have 3 different places to have a front desk and to have people to maintain and to have roofs to replace and have boilers to replace, and I've been there. And so in a town this size, it makes sense to make sure we're as cost effective as possible in allocating all of these resources. So that's what we're trying to do with these plans. And we can have a lot more discussions about that at a later date, but that's the thought process to date on facilities. With Cityhood, will we have control of the zoning and warehouses on Mountain House Parkway? That's an excellent question. When Mountain House was created, there was a real emphasis on there being as many jobs as houses, which has always been the dream in San Joaquin County. And I started working in San Joaquin County, I think about the week before this master plan was adopted. And I can tell you and I did take some detours to other counties, but in the last 29 years, there's always been these dreams of these huge amount of jobs coming from the Bay Area out to San Joaquin County. And by the way, there were 15,000 people going over the hill when I got here in 1994. There's only 100,000 more now. And the challenge is, the guy in the corner office still wants to be in the South Bay. All that empty land next to the warehouses across from Kimball, that had the zoning they wanted to build another PeopleSoft/Oracle center over there. And you can see they got 0 takers. It's always been a challenge in San Joaquin County to bring jobs out. But that was part of the promise of Mountain House. We would be that first place over the hill for jobs. And we really thought the last couple of years, just before COVID, the brokers were telling me that, with the tech industry expanding so much in the East Bay, a lot of the remaining small manufacturers and distributors, they're all going to lose their leases and move out to the valley. And when Panettone decided to build that building down the street here, they already had a list of folks over in places like San Leandro and Dublin and old buildings that thought, well, they're going to move out here. COVID hit. 2 things happened. 1, a lot of those people got their leases renewed. And 2, you kind of notice our housing prices doubled during that time. And so, for example, there was a guy out of the East Bay who'd been looking very seriously. I think he was in lease negotiations. And as the prices went up, he realized that none of his employees can afford to live anywhere near Mountain House. And so he ended up in Turlock. And a lot of the other businesses either didn't come, or they're saying, if I want to be able to afford, I'm going to have to go Highway 99 corridor. So they've had a real challenge, unless it's a Tesla, frankly, a Tesla related person who needs the ability to get back into the Bay Area quickly. And again, a lot of those people are not losing their leases in the Bay Area now. Those are the businesses we're getting. And so the current zoning, though, made it where those couldn't just be empty warehouses with just pallets and maybe one person working with them, because the original zoning said you have to have a focus on job creation in everything you do here in Mountain House. So once we've already got going to the county next month an update on the jobs housing balance to make it more realistic. But if we were to become a community, then all bets are off and the community can make that decision as to what they want to put in those buildings. Now, it still will have to meet standard parking requirements, still have to go through what's called an environmental review to make sure it's not going to have any negative impacts on the surrounding community, but it's not going to be restricted to job intensive uses if the city council makes that decision. So please pass that on, because I get that question. And I'm glad you asked, because I get that question every single day. So why not build indoor sports facility where sports and events can take place sooner? There's the warehouse right there. I think you will find that most of your indoor sports facilities were originally built as something else, because they don't. In fact, you'll find most of your nicer hotels, they always call it the rule of three. It's usually the third guy who makes money on a hotel. Most hotels, most high-rise office buildings are done during crazy times with people with crazy ideas, and it's usually the third guy who makes money. When I worked up in Lake Tahoe, we're now on our third or fourth person on some of those, on the Calneva Hotel, for example. But when you go to most of these indoor sports facilities around the valley, it typically wasn't something that was built originally for something else, which is why only government builds pools and builds indoor gyms and things like that, because they don't pay for themselves. But if you can get a good lease in an existing building where they've already written off half the debt, then there are those opportunities for those types of centers. But I can assure you, whether we're a city or remaining a district, we're gonna, as we continue to work with our Recreation Commission, who gets to spend all the hard time going through these things, right? We're gonna have a good dialogue on what should be in a recreation center, the realistic cash flow of a recreation center, and how we're gonna pay for that. And the only thing that's harder to pencil out than a recreation center is the pool. But again, part of the purpose of government is to provide those amenities that no one else can bring in. But when it comes to recreation, it's not like water where we have to provide water or safety. Recreation's a la carte, and it's really up to the community to decide how much recreation you're going to be consuming. And so that's why it's so important to it's why we don't really ask you about how our UV system works at the water plant, because we'll take your input, but the state and feds tell us what to do. But when it comes to whether we have an indoor sports facility, that's your call. When are we going to have a good cellular network coverage? Well, that's a population density issue. And as board member Tingle can tell you, we had to beg someone to come in 10, 11 years ago to even put a tower up and give them a great deal on a lease. And that's the only reason we have a tower. And we have a tower now that other people can attach onto, and we're still not getting a lot of takers for that. And I think part of it is there's still this debate over some of the differing, the DAS technology and things like that. But it's one of those things when you're an isolated community of 30,000 people and you don't have anybody else around you, you probably have to get up. I think we're getting up on that cusp of where things start to pencil out for folks. But that's the thing. People will say, well, there's all these other cities of 30,000. Well, yeah, if you're 30,000 surrounded by 2 million people, but if you draw a 5-mile radius around Mountain House, like if you look at the huge boundary of our school district, and 99%, we're probably 5% of the land of the school district, but we're 99% of the residents within the entire boundaries of the Lambertville School District. So they're just, I mean, I can tell you, even when I was working in Long Beach, the challenge is when half your radius is fish and another half your radius is oil refineries, there's a reason why all those things go inland. And so it's nice to be isolated, but then it has its downsides as well. What are the chances of a majority yes vote? Have no idea. We're here just to provide the information. We haven't done any surveys or anything like that. Our job is just to make sure that you make an informed decision. Doesn't mean we're going to guess at it, but not yet, not yet. But the polls are open. Don't forget, polls are open. What is the timeline for a subsidiary organization to manage the CC&Rs? The CC&Rs will continue to be managed by the Community Services District. And what will happen is the City Council will have every once in a while, like during the budget, they will meet as the City Council and the subsidiary district. So there'll be a small budget to manage the CC&Rs that the City Council will have a separate hat. Just like if we were to build a parking structure, we might have a parking authority for that. So it's just a subset. It's a different legal entity, but it's the same 5 people. It's not a separate group. It's just a different entity, and that's why they call it a subsidiary district. All right. All right, another question about the warehouses. So I think I covered that one. Did anyone calculate the amount Mountain House received from the extra taxes we get? Yes, there is online. We have the CFA online, correct? So the longest part of the process for going through this incorporation cityhood process is the economics. And there's a prescribed method for reviewing that. Now, I will tell you that the board of directors smartly did a preliminary analysis first to make sure that it looked like it was going to pencil out, because it wouldn't be responsible to spend 4 times as much on the study unless you did a preliminary study. So in 2020, the board did do a preliminary study to make sure that it made sense financially. And then the county and LAFCO required this very exhaustive, what's called comprehensive fiscal analysis that went through every aspect of our budget, every revenue source, every expenditure source. And it's all prescribed by the law, and it's about a 130-page document that you can get on our website. And it did show that you're only supposed to, I think the law only requires showing 3 years, but of course that's not responsible. So we did about a 10 to 12 year cash flow to demonstrate that it made sense. And I think the reason that the cash flows made sense is that other than land use, animal control, and a portion of police, we're already performing all the duties of a municipal corporation, of a city. And so, as I mentioned earlier, by doing this, we have the additional responsibilities we're taking on for land use. Most of those get charged in fees to the developer. There are some stranded costs, but not a whole lot from your land use function. It's mainly your police function and your animal control function that you're taking on an additional fiscal burden, and we're getting additional property tax, we're getting the documentary transfer tax, and we're getting the additional road taxes that balance out the additional cost we'd be taking for law enforcement and animal control. Now, the challenge in the future, whether we're a community services district or a city, is that this is just a pro forma. Just, each year our budgets are pro forma, and the decisions that you make as a board, or in the future, if it's a city council, is you have to make the right decisions each year so that it doesn't haunt you 5 years from now. We have to make sure that we're not taking on costs and that we're maintaining. For example, the board mandates that we have a pavement management plan. And what that means is when we're doing that, we have a program that tells us exactly when streets get to a certain condition. If you go out and slurry seal those streets, they're going to last a lot longer than if you wait until you have to rebuild those streets. And it's about 4 times as expensive to wait until the street is falling apart than it is just to maintain that street over time. You'll notice that we lost very few trees in the windstorm the other day. And that's because 4 years ago, the board began the process of saying, we need to work in partnership with the community on tree trimming. In the past, the previous attorneys had discouraged them from that, but most cities have found that if you have a citywide tree program, first of all, it costs 1/10 as much for us to trim that tree as it does for the homeowner to trim that tree. And by keeping your trees trimmed, not only do the trees stay healthier, but They don't destroy the sidewalk, and then we don't have to replace the sidewalk as well. And that's another thing we've been doing, is maintaining the sidewalks. So if you go into a community like ours that doesn't have a good tree trimming program, like if you went to parts of the county and other cities that don't do it anymore, you would have seen a lot more tree damage than we had the last couple of days. So those are the hidden things that you do that don't show up in your balanced budget, but the things that you need to do as a responsible municipal corporation. And those of us who inherited communities that didn't do that and had to live through the recession, it makes you very, very cautious of not taking on more than you can handle, and understanding that a truly sustainable budget isn't just balancing your current expenditures, but making sure you're saving for your rainy day and maintaining your assets. And we're in a great position here to do that. A lot of cities, when they incorporate, like the cities that incorporated 10 years ago in Riverside County, those cities were built under very lax standards. In fact, that's why the county wanted those cities to incorporate, because those areas were getting to be about 30 years old, and the county knew a big bill was coming due. And they frankly said, here, you take all this on. I mean, the reason those cities existed was because it was cheaper to build out there, and, you know, that extra 2-inch concrete in the sidewalk, who needs that? You know, do you even need sidewalks? Do you even need to maintain roads? But I can tell you from day one, and this is where the county did a great job. When the developer proposed this, they made it clear, you're going to build this to standard, and you're going to build it right. And then we brought on our own staff back in 2001, because there were a couple things in Wickland, the very first neighborhood, they didn't build everything to exactly the right standard. But since then, this district has been vigilant in making sure that things are built to last, they're built to code, they're built to be safe, and we're making sure that they remain maintained. But because we have been maintaining the infrastructure, we don't have a lot of stuff from the olden days, so to speak. You know, other than Byron and Bethany and Wickland roads, we don't have we don't have a lot of surprises facing us, because our staff built all the infrastructure. It was all built to modern standards, not saying it's perfect, and not saying that you don't always, you never know when beavers are going to come and screw up your creek and cause you Mother Nature doesn't always give you a break on these things, but this city was planned from the beginning to be sustainable. And there's other little things, like, for example, we all know that Maine and Arturo never needed to be 4-lane roads. And those are things, you know, we're looking at potentially in the future at shrinking those roads. Not only will that reduce the traffic, but it reduces the amount of pavement that we have to maintain over time also. So those are the real challenges going forward. And that's true whether we're a city or we're a district. It's so important that everybody in the community, as I did, I thank you all at the beginning for coming, because the more vigilance there is from the community and the more interest in kind of these less exciting things than we may see on social media, these are the things that keep it a healthy place to live in the long run. So it looks like while I filibustered there were some more questions. Are you considering having a Tesla supercharge at Mountain House? I don't see value in additional gas station when there are tons of Teslas. Well, it's interesting because I think the gas station potentially looking at the south side of Grant Line Road has been talking about that. In fact, I think some of your traditional gas stations are wondering whether they want to continue to expand, especially in a town with a lot of Tesla. So that's one of these things, as we get more, if we were to get more involved in economic development, we can have more dialogue. But I know Chevron was having second thoughts about this location down here with all the changes happening in the future. How much does Mountain have to pay to fund the election? Well, we only fund the election if it's successful. But we did have to fund the study, because when the county, normally under state law, the county has to fund the study, but the county, when the county was on both sides of the agreement, changed that back in 1996 to where we did have to fund study. But Nicole, what do we think, between 80 and 100,000 for the election? But we think, again, revenue rise, we think the amount of revenue we'd be bringing in, even in the first year, even what little sales tax we get would cover that. Would become a city have any impact on schools? They will have no impact on schools, whether it's ourselves or the county as the land use entity. We do have to coordinate with the schools to make sure that as we're building neighborhoods, we also have schools to accommodate those folks. And I can tell you, we work very closely with the school district. For example, we had the ability to, let's just say, help one of the developers who make sure that 14 million made it directly to the school instead of to that developer, to make sure that there was the gap funding to get Costa built. So we've done everything at our end to make sure the schools have been built. And as we've been planning with the school district, we make sure that they've got flexible space. One of the, I mentioned earlier, these huge challenges for building parks. School district has that same challenge when it comes to building schools, that the costs have become extraordinary. And I could tell you, you get great bargains here in Mountain House. Another thing you have to thank the county for back in the 1990s was they required the developers to dedicate all the land for the parks and schools. In many communities, the school district has to purchase the land for the schools. And so, yes, Costa School was expensive at $59 million, because back in the old days, that would have been a $20 million school. But that land would have been, if he'd been building that in another community, you might have also be paying the developer another $20 million for the school. So I think we've got very high quality, cost effective schools here. K through 8s are much more cost effective to build than middle schools and K through 5s. The other thing I think our school district is looking at is that one of the real challenges for the long-term health of a school district is, in every community, when it's a new community, you have this huge number of kids flowing through the schools. And no matter how desirable the school district, once you funnel out that first generation, there's never going to be as many kids being generated out of the next. And by the way, our birth rates are nosediving in the country. So even if this becomes a place where people continue to come for schools, there's even now they're finding for the families are having fewer kids than they were even a couple years ago. So as the school district, one thing the school district doesn't want to have is 10 years from now having excess capacity in these K through 8s. And so, people are concerned about Costa. Did they build it big enough? Did they build Cordes big enough? Did they build Hanson big enough? Well, one of the things they do have the ability to do, just as they do at the high school, is they do have the ability to add additional modular classrooms on a temporary basis, because quite often you're going to see these schools at 1,100 and then peak it down to 700. And for you, the taxpayer, it's a lot more cost effective to accommodate those extra students on campus than it is to build another school. And I could tell you, my very first day in government was in a community where they just had a huge battle over which of their high schools was going to close, because it was a town, this was early 80s. And in the 60s, they were bursting at the seams. And then by the 80s, all these schools were half empty. And so, that's one of the things that we want to work in partnership with the school district on too. Just like we want us to be sustainable, we want them to be sustainable as well, because half full schools, you still have to maintain those schools, and that takes away from what's happening in the classroom. Will Cityhood ensure quick implementation of the BART extension? Cityhood will not hurt the relationship with Valley Link, but I would say about 99% of the Valley is dependent on getting about $1 billion from other sources. So unless each Mountain House resident wants to write about a $200,000 check, I think we're still dependent on the federal government to make sure. And I can tell you, we will, either as a district or as a city, be having a lot more dialogue in the future, because we do have to partner with, while they're paying for the main line, any city that gets a station is going to have to come up with a funding plan for that station. Now, I think we have some good ways of doing that. We can charge for parking. We can potentially look at putting in little districts, taxing districts right around the station, but there will be a significant amount of money that will need to be generated by some type of local financing. But as I said, it'll probably be very user focused. But yeah, there'll be tens of millions of dollars that need to go into the station and into the operation of the station as well. And that's something that Livermore, and I'm hoping that, again, having a seat at the table at the Council of Governments will help as well. I think the Livermore Pleasanton stations are getting a good chunk of their money from countywide sources. So it will certainly help Valley Link if we were a member of COG, and we can only be a member of COG if we are a city. Yes. On here, okay, 1, 2. I've heard Safeway Mountain House prices are higher. We have no control over Mountain House Safeway pricing. I can tell you when I worked in Incline Village, our Rayleigh's in Incline Village had its own entire pricing zone. You know, that's something that they decide from. It's amazing when I knew it was a tourist weekend because all the price tags changed in Rayleigh's back in the day. But that's something to take up with Safeway. We have no control over that. When will the community build a swimming pool? That is part of the recreation center project. And right now the phasing is the next phase of the project would be the tennis courts, amphitheater, dog park. About 18 months after that would be the sports fields and the Little League fields. And then the next phase would be the rec center and the pool. But I think even later this year, I anticipate starting to have dialogue with the Recreation Commission about timing and what kind of pool and those sorts of things. Because we know there's huge demand for a pool here in Mountain House. And frankly, a 6-foot deep high school lap pool is not the ideal setup for a pool. The designs would be for both a lap pool and what's called a zero entry play pool would be over at the recreation center. But those are things we have to figure out how to make sure we can afford to pay and maintain. And it's going to be, as I said, ultimately up to the community how that happens. But I think we're much closer than we were a couple of years ago to making that happen. So I think I got all three there. Existing businesses, will they be paying taxes to the new city? Well, for example, yeah, all the special taxes that you pay on your home, which work out to about 70 cents a square foot, all of the existing businesses pay that as well. That big warehouse over here pays over $300,000 just in special tax right now. So, and Safeway probably pays about 40,000 a year because it's based on your square footage. And so, yes, all the businesses pay special tax, they pay property tax, and if they generate sales tax, we get a portion of the sales tax. It will be up to the future city council to determine whether they do a business license tax or any other type of tax on businesses. In communities with large employers, they have head tax, but we will unlikely be that kind. We don't have Hughes Corporation with 70,000 employees or anything like that here. All right. Would we get a post office? No. I mentioned this at the last meeting that working with the post office is quite the challenge. Just getting the Wickland mailboxes was a very long process. And I can tell you that during that time, I lost track of the different people we had to contact. And my last contact, I was so shocked because the guy in Sacramento, I think he was in West Sacramento, said, we've redrawn the boundary lines for our districts. And I said, oh, so are we in the San Francisco district now? He goes, no, you're in the Los Angeles district now. So believe it or not, the LA district takes the entire valley up to San Joaquin County, and Sacramento goes all the way up to the border of California, and the Bay Area is just the Bay Area. So we are now part of the Los Angeles post office district. And when I said Mountain House, I could just hear on the phone this blank stare of, Mountain, just like you probably get all the time. Mountain View? You mean Mountain View? I go, no, Mountain House. And so the post office is consolidating more than they are expanding at this point in time. I think we have gotten the post office to behave a little better about accepting Mountain House zip code. Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying now is that that's off the table because of the rezoning with part of the LA and not the city.
I'm just saying that from all our indications, the Postal Service is looking to eliminate as many post offices as they can and consolidating. And so I think it'll be a real challenge. And I think being part of a faraway district is going to make it an even larger challenge. But I think it's the sort of thing where the only person who can even get a call back is your congressman at this point in time. Right. I totally agree. I mean, I'm hoping that we can at least get a UPS store or something like that. And Can't remember if we've had any discussions on that. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, we want, at least we have pretty much our own zip code. I can tell you there's challenge. I've worked in communities that have been in 3 different city zip codes, and you just get this blank stare when you want to. And what happens when you have that happen is all these people come to your city council meetings based on their mailing address. I know I had to put Tracy on my driver's license because the only utility bill with me would only would put in Tracy 95391. Will the apartments generate revenue for the city? The apartments generate the same special tax revenue that single family homes generate. So they pay very hefty, I know people don't like their $200 water bill. I can assure you it's a much more expensive water bill for the apartments. I think it was what? The initial bill was what? The connection was about $300,000, I think, just for the first 6 months or something like that for their charge. So the apartments more than pave their way at this point in time when it comes to costs. And it's 304 units. And I think their grand opening is coming up very soon. I think, in fact, I think it's this Sunday that the urgent care is having their grand opening, but I can't remember when the apartments are. It was in the paper. So any more questions online? All right, well, thank you, everyone. Folks here, we can stick around and talk. But thank you, everybody online. Again, I really appreciate everybody's time and interest. And you're welcome to contact us if you have any additional questions. I think we've got a spot on the website where we can do that, right, Sarah? Where if you have questions, we can get back to you through the website. So thanks very much. Thank you. It's now elections.